They weren't heroes in shining armor, they were truck drivers, mechanics, and dispatchers, racing through war-torn France on roads lit only by moonlight and fire. Every gallon of fuel, every bullet, every meal for the front depended on them. They called it the Red Ball Express, a lifeline built from courage, speed, and sheer exhaustion. But behind the roaring engines lay danger, sacrifice, and a story the world nearly forgot. In the summer of 1944, the roads of northern France trembled beneath the weight of victory. The Allies had broken through Normandy's hedgerows, and the German army was in retreat. But for the men of the Red Ball Express, victory came with a different sound, the low growl of diesel engines, the rhythmic thump of worn tires, and the endless hum of motion. Their war was not fought with rifles or artillery, but with gasoline, grit, and courage. The Red Ball Express was born out of necessity, the kind of urgency only war can demand. In August 1944, the Allied armies advancing through France found themselves trapped by their own success. The great breakout from Normandy had driven the Germans back faster than anyone expected, but the supply lines couldn't keep up. The front was moving hundreds of miles ahead of the beaches where all their fuel, ammunition, and food were still arriving. Every tank that rolled forward, every aircraft that flew overhead, every soldier who marched east, they all depended on one thing, a constant flow of supplies. And that flow had nearly stopped. The railroads were shattered. Bridges lay in ruins, bombed by both sides. The ports the Allies needed were still in enemy hands. There was only one solution, the open road. And so, on August 25, 1944, the U.S. Army launched an operation unlike anything it had ever attempted before, a non-stop convoy system that would keep the front alive. They called it the Red Ball Express. The name came from American railroad slang. Red Ball meant priority freight, shipments that had to move fast, without delay. Painted red circles marked their route, and trucks bearing the insignia had the right of way, day or night. It was a simple idea, but the execution was monumental. In less than a week, engineers and logistics officers designed an entire highway system dedicated to one purpose, moving supplies at any cost. The route stretched from the beaches of Normandy to the forward depots near Chartres and beyond, over 700 miles of open road when counting both directions. Traffic only moved one way on each route, loaded trucks went east on one side, empty ones returned on the other. Military police manned every intersection, keeping the flow unbroken. And then came the drivers, thousands of them, hastily trained, many of them barely out of high school. More than 3/4 of those drivers were African American soldiers. The U.S. Army was still segregated then, and many black troops were assigned to service units rather than combat roles. But in the Red Ball Express, they found a mission that demanded everything they had, and proved beyond doubt that they could carry the war on their shoulders. They drove around the clock, often with little sleep, under the constant threat of ambush, accident, or exhaustion. Each man learned to live by the rhythm of the road. The trucks, usually 2.5-ton GMCs known as Jimmies, were pushed to their limits. Their engines overheated, their tires shredded, their suspensions rattled apart under impossible loads. But still, the convoys rolled. Dust hung in the air like fog. The smell of diesel and sweat clung to their uniforms. Men learned to catnap sitting upright behind the wheel, one hand on the gearshift, one ear tuned to the engine's hum. They traveled in columns that stretched for miles, each truck following the dim taillight of the one ahead, a red dot in the darkness, bobbing through the French countryside like a ghostly procession. Speed was life. If one truck stopped, the whole line could back up for miles, and every delay meant fuel tanks running dry at the front. There were rules: no passing, no stopping, no lights. Only momentum. Only motion. Accidents were common. Roads were narrow, pitted, and jammed with debris. Bridges were temporary, sometimes just planks laid over bombed spans. Drivers fought fatigue, fog, and enemy fire. Some convoys were strafed by German planes, others lost trucks to snipers or land mines. But the men kept driving. They called themselves the Lifeline. And they were. Each day, the Red Ball Express moved thousands of tons of supplies, fuel for Patton's tanks, ammunition for the front, rations for the troops. The convoys became so constant that French villagers came to know their sound before they saw them. Children waved as they passed, old women stood at doorways, offering apples, bread, sometimes a smile. To the people of war-torn France, the Red Ball trucks meant hope, the sound of liberation rolling east. Inside the cab of a truck, the world was a blur of motion. The drivers formed tight bonds, built on shared exhaustion and danger. They sang to stay awake, blues songs, gospel tunes, sometimes just nonsense verses shouted over the roar of the engine. Cigarettes burned low in trembling fingers. Coffee, if they had it, was strong and bitter. Sleep was a luxury few could afford. When they did rest, it was in makeshift camps by the roadside, tents pitched between the roaring lines of trucks, the air still thick with exhaust. Mechanics worked through the night, patching tires, tightening bolts, coaxing another few miles out of battered machines. Everyone knew that if the trucks stopped, the war might stall with them. By early September, the Red Ball Express was moving more than 12,000 tons of supplies a day. It was a miracle of improvisation, thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, all coordinated through maps, chalkboards, and sheer willpower. Patton's Third Army advanced nearly 100 miles in just a few days, fueled by the gas these drivers hauled. But the strain was enormous. Many of the roads weren't built for such heavy use. Convoy routes turned to mud in the rain, and the trucks carved deep ruts into the earth. Tires blew out by the hundreds. Spare parts ran short. Yet the drivers pressed on. They joked that they didn't need maps, just follow the smell of burned rubber and spilled gasoline. Every trip was a gamble. Some convoys drove through nights so dark that drivers couldn't see beyond the hood. They followed instinct, the faint glow of a taillight, or just blind trust. If a truck overturned, others would stop long enough to pull the driver out, and then move on. There was no time to waste. The mission mattered more than any one man. Though their faces were young, their eyes soon looked older, lined with fatigue, hardened by experience. Many had never driven a truck before the war, now they were veterans of the road, commanding tons of steel through chaos. For them, the Red Ball Express wasn't just a supply route. It was a test of endurance, courage, and dignity. Officers and commanders began to realize what these men were accomplishing. They weren't just keeping the front alive, they were building a legacy of determination and skill that would change how armies thought about logistics forever. Eisenhower himself called the Red Ball Express the lifeline of victory. Without it, he said, the advance across Europe might have failed. Still, the work took its toll. Convoys ran 24 hours a day. Engines burned out. Men collapsed at the wheel. The line between exhaustion and disaster was razor-thin. But no matter how tired they were, the drivers returned to the road. They had orders, but they also had pride, the knowledge that what they were doing mattered in a way few things ever would. By mid-September, the Red Ball Express had reached its peak. More than 6,000 trucks roamed the highways of France, manned by nearly 23,000 drivers and mechanics. The route ran like an artery of steel and determination, feeding the heart of the Allied advance. Yet as autumn drew in, the weather changed. Rain turned dust to sludge, slowing progress to a crawl. The front line kept moving, stretching supply distances even farther. And then came new challenges: traffic jams, fuel shortages, breakdowns, and the constant need to reorganize. The miracle was beginning to strain under its own weight. But for now, in that fleeting window between chaos and exhaustion, the Red Ball Express stood as a symbol of what determination could achieve. It was an army within an army, not of generals or heroes in medals, but of men behind the wheel, hands gripping the steering wheel as if holding the front line itself. They didn't fight for glory. They fought to keep the war moving. And as long as the engines kept running, victory remained possible. By the time September turned to October 1944, the Red Ball Express had become both legend and burden. What had begun as a desperate improvisation had evolved into a massive, living organism, tens of thousands of men and machines moving with relentless rhythm across a war-torn continent. But like every organism pushed to its limits, it began to show the signs of exhaustion. The convoys grew slower. Rain came heavier. The same roads that had carried victory forward were now slick with mud and oil. In the chill mornings, fog settled low across the fields, swallowing the convoys whole. Drivers could see nothing ahead, nothing behind, only the red blur of the taillight in front of them, glowing dim through the mist. They followed that light like a promise, like a heartbeat. Accidents multiplied. A moment's inattention, a slick turn, a wheel catching in the soft shoulder, and a truck could roll, sometimes taking others with it. When that happened, the line didn't stop. Men pulled the wounded clear, marked the wreck for recovery, and rolled on. The cargo could not wait, fuel was gold now. Every drum of gasoline meant another mile for the tanks on the front. The irony wasn't lost on the drivers. They were hauling fuel for Patton's tanks while rationing their own, siphoning fumes to keep moving. Sometimes they used captured German fuel, the smell sharp and unfamiliar, the risk of sabotage always in their minds. Enemy resistance was weaker than before but never gone. German aircraft still prowled the skies, and even a lone fighter could turn a convoy into a line of fire. When the alarms came, men jumped from their trucks and dove into ditches, covering their heads as bullets sparked off metal and rubber burned. When the planes were gone, they climbed back in, brushed off the dirt, and drove on. There was no room for fear. At night, the world belonged to them. The road was their battlefield, their front line, their home. The dashboard glow was faint, the air cold. Some men drove with cigarettes pressed between their teeth, the ember a tiny beacon in the dark. Others prayed softly, whispering to themselves over the engine's drone. Time lost meaning. The war was measured not in days but in miles, endless, grinding miles. There were few comforts. Showers were rare. Meals came from mess tins, eaten standing beside the truck, one eye on the next departure. Letters from home took weeks to arrive, and when they did, the words felt like voices from another world. One driver wrote to his mother, "I can't tell you where I am, but I can tell you it's nothing but road. When I dream of road." Racism followed the black drivers even here, though the front line didn't care what color a man's skin was when he brought the fuel that kept it alive. They lived under white officers, often faced disrespect from soldiers they supplied, and yet, when the chips were down, everyone knew the truth: without them, the advance would stop. Their quiet endurance spoke louder than any speech could. Many of these men had come from farms, factories, and small towns back home, places where they'd never been trusted with responsibility, never been seen as equals. Now, they were operating one of the largest, most critical transport networks in the history of warfare. They kept the world's most powerful army moving. And they did it under pressure, danger, and exhaustion that few could comprehend. By late autumn, the Red Ball Express had carried more than 400,000 tons of supplies across France. Its success allowed the Allies to maintain their momentum all the way to the German border. But success came at a cost. Trucks broke down faster than they could be repaired. Spare tires were scavenged from wrecks. Men collapsed from fatigue, sleeping in the mud beside their trucks, too tired to crawl inside. Eventually, as new ports opened, Cherbourg, Antwerp, and rail lines were repaired, the Red Ball Express began to fade. It had done its job. Slowly, the convoys dwindled, the routes shortened, and the operation that had once symbolized the unstoppable momentum of victory began to wind down. By November 1944, the Red Ball Express officially ended. Its mission was complete. But for the men who drove it, it never really ended. The road stayed with them, the vibration in their hands, the ghost of the engine's hum in their ears, the memories of faces glimpsed through rain-streaked windshields. Some spoke of the pride they felt, others spoke of the fear. Most said little at all. They went home quietly, back to the lives they had left behind, carrying a story that few people asked to hear. For years after the war, the Red Ball Express was remembered mostly as a line on a map, a logistical marvel. But maps don't show exhaustion, or courage, or the smell of burning fuel. They don't show the young man gripping a steering wheel with frozen fingers, or the laughter around a campfire before dawn, or the unspoken understanding that history was riding in the back of their truck. The truth of the Red Ball Express lies not in numbers, but in people. In Private John Smith from Georgia, who drove 15 hours straight through a storm to deliver ammunition. In Sergeant Thomas Lewis from Detroit, who organized his men with military precision and refused to lose a single load to delay. In the unnamed mechanic who stayed up 3 nights patching radiators with tape and faith. In the men who were never photographed, whose names were never printed, but who made victory possible. As the war moved east and winter set in, many of the Red Ball veterans were reassigned to other duties, some to new convoy systems that carried the war deeper into Germany, others back to supply depots or motor pools. But the lessons of what they had done spread far beyond the battlefields. The Red Ball Express proved that logistics was not a backwater of warfare, but its beating heart. It showed that victory depended not just on generals and tactics, but on the ordinary men who kept the wheels turning. In the decades that followed, historians began to tell their story, slowly at first, then with growing recognition. Documentaries, interviews, books, each tried to capture the scale and spirit of what those drivers had accomplished. Veterans reunited, old photographs resurfaced, and the memories that had lived quietly in their minds became part of the nation's larger memory. Even so, many still felt forgotten. They had carried the war, but not the glory. For too long, their story sat in the shadow of the battles they made possible. Yet when you listen to their voices, the few that were recorded, the few that survived, you hear pride, not bitterness. "We did what had to be done," one veteran said. "We kept them moving. That's what mattered." In later years, military historians would describe the Red Ball Express as one of the most remarkable logistical achievements in modern warfare. In just 81 days, it moved more than 500,000 tons of supplies, enough fuel and ammunition to sustain multiple armies on the march. It was built from scratch, operated around the clock, and manned largely by troops who had been underestimated, undervalued, and overlooked. And yet, they delivered. The Red Ball Express became a template for the future, for Korea, for Vietnam, for every conflict where supply lines would define success. It also became a symbol of unity under pressure, of men who rose above circumstance to do something extraordinary. Today, when people look back at the Second World War, they remember the battles, Normandy, the Bulge, the Rhine. But behind every tank that rolled and every plane that flew was a driver in a muddy truck, somewhere on a French road, eyes half open, heart steady, hauling the lifeblood of war forward. Somewhere in northern France, a rusted road sign still stands, its paint faded but the words barely visible, Red Ball Route. Grass grows over the ditches now, the sound of engines long gone. But if you stand there long enough, in the quiet, you can almost hear it, the low rumble of a convoy in the distance, the echo of determination rolling through time. Those men are gone now, most of them. But their legacy remains in every military convoy, every supply chain that keeps an army alive. They prove that victory is not only won on battlefields but along the endless roads that feed them. The Red Ball Express was more than a route. It was a heartbeat, the pulse that kept the Allied armies alive in Europe. It was courage measured in miles, heroism written in diesel and dust. And though their journey ended long ago, the story of those who drove the Red Ball Express will always keep rolling on, mile after mile, into history.